In the underground pulse of the underground club, the rule for the staff was etched in fear. Be a ghost, be a machine, and never, under any circumstances, look at the face of the man in the corner booth. Jasmine understood the geometry of survival. For years, she had navigated the neon-slicked labyrinth of soul by mastering the art of the shadow. Her deep, mahogany skin was her natural cloak, allowing her to melt into the dim, bluish corners of the VIP section while the city's most dangerous men moved like predators around her. But tonight, the air in the lounge felt heavy, charged with the kind of static that precedes a lightning strike. At the center of the storm sat Raesung. He was known as the Iron Boss, a man who architected peace through violence. He sat perfectly still, his tailored black suit absorbing the light, his features looking as though they were carved from ice and obsidian. Jasmine stepped forward to refresh the table, her hands steady despite the suffocating tension. As she leaned in, a desperate associate across the table slammed his fist down, pleading for a life already forfeited. The vibration sent a crystal decanter tilting. A single, dark splash of amber liquid hit the pristine white cuff of Raesung's shirt. The room went dead silent. The music seemed to die. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't drop the tray or beg for mercy like the girls before her. Instead, she reached into her apron, pulled out a clean linen cloth, and reached for his wrist. Her warm, dark fingers brushed against his cold skin. "It will stain if you let it sit," she whispered, her voice a calm, melodic silk. She looked up. For the first time, she broke the rule. She looked directly into Raesung's eyes. They were depthless and fixed on her with a predatory curiosity. He didn't pull away. He watched her nimble fingers work against his sleeve, tracking the contrast of her skin against his white cuff. "You have a steady hand for a shadow," Raesung remarked, his voice a low vibration she felt in her marrow. "I have a lot to lose if I'm clumsy," Jasmine replied, stepping back. As she walked away, she felt his gaze like a brand on her back. She had spent years trying to be a shadow, but in 1 second, she had become the only thing the most dangerous man in Seoul wanted to see. Hey loves, while you're here, hit the subscribe button to always get notifications for more content like this. And also don't forget to like the video and drop your comments below. Seoul didn't breathe, it vibrated. For Jasmine, the city was a relentless machine of neon and cold concrete that demanded a high price for the simple right to exist. As she navigated the narrow, rain-slicked arteries of Itaewon, she pulled her hood low, disappearing into the gray blur of the evening rush. She had learned early on that in a land where she stood out like a drop of ink on white silk, her only true protection was the code of shadows. To the immigration office, she was a string of digits on a work visa. To the locals, she was a curiosity to be stared at or a ghost to be ignored. By day, she survived on convenience store kimbap and the grueling labor of back alley dishwashing, her hands perpetually pruned and smelling of industrial soap. Every one she earned was a prayer sent back home, a shield for her family against the poverty she had fled. But by night, the stakes changed. The underground club sat beneath a nondescript luxury hotel, a subterranean kingdom where the laws of the surface world ceased to apply. As Jasmine stepped through the heavy steel doors, the acrid scent of expensive tobacco and expensive sins hit her. Here, the air was thick with the sandalwood and ginger of men who bought and sold lives between sips of vintage whiskey. She moved into the locker room, shedding her damp jacket for the stark, monochromatic uniform of the service staff. The code here was even stricter. You were a tool, a silent extension of the velvet furniture. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't linger. And never, ever look at the corner booth, the floor manager had hissed at her on her first night. Jasmine adjusted her collar, catching her reflection in the cracked mirror. Her mahogany skin looked rich against the black fabric, but she didn't see beauty. She saw a target. She practiced the mask she had worn for 3 years, the empty, subservient gaze of the marginalized. As she stepped onto the floor, the bluish city light from the street was replaced by the violet-hued haze of the VIP section. The atmosphere was brittle, like thin glass waiting for a heavy boot. In the corner booth, a silhouette moved, a flicker of movement that sent a ripple of visible fear through the veteran servers. Rae-sung was there. The Iron Boss was a gravity well, pulling the energy of the room toward his silent, lethal presence. Jasmine kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her heart a drum against her ribs. She was a shadow. She was a ghost. She was safe as long as she remained nobody. The violet haze of the lounge felt like a physical weight, pressing against Jasmine's lungs as she approached the center of the storm. Table 7 was an island of absolute silence in the middle of the club's roar. There sat Rae-sung, the Iron Boss, his presence so heavy it seemed to bend the light around him. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply existed as a mountain of ice and black silk. Jasmine's pulse thrummed in her fingertips as she reached for the crystal decanter. Beside Rae-sung, a man who looked like he had been carved from desperation was trembling, his forehead slick with a cold sweat that caught the neon light. He was an underboss, a man who had clearly failed to build what the architect had designed. "Please, Mr. Kong," the man stammered, his voice cracking. "The shipments, they were hijacked. I can make it right. Just give me—" He lunged forward, not in attack, but in a frantic, clumsy plea for mercy. His hand caught the edge of the table. The world slowed. Jasmine watched as the heavy glass decanter tipped, the amber liquid inside sloshing toward the edge. It fell with a soft, muted thud against the table's edge, sending a spray of Hennessy directly onto the pristine white cuff of Rae-sung's shirt. The silence that followed was deafening. The music in the room didn't stop, but it seemed to recede into the distance, leaving only the sound of Jasmine's own heart. The bodyguards stepped from the shadows, their hands disappearing into their jackets. The underboss turned ashen, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream of realization. Jasmine didn't think.
She didn't beg.
She reached into her apron and pulled out a clean linen cloth, stepping into the space where most feared to breathe. Her fingers, warm and dark, closed around Rae-sung's wrist. His skin was unnaturally cold, like stone pulled from a winter river. She felt the iron strength in his arm, the coiled power of a predator. "If you let it set, the silk is ruined," she whispered. Her voice was steady, a melodic thread of silk that dared to stitch the tension back together. She began to work, her nimble fingers blotting the stain with a precision born of years of survival. Then, she did the one thing the code forbade. She looked up. Her gaze collided with his. His eyes were obsidian, depthless, black, and currently fixed on her with a predatory curiosity that made her breath hitch. He didn't pull away. He watched the contrast of her mahogany skin against his white sleeve, his pupils expanding until they swallowed the light. "You have a steady hand for a shadow," Rae-sung remarked, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that she felt in the very marrow of her bones. "Shadows have to be precise, Mr. Rae-sung," Jasmine replied, her voice unwavering as she stepped back into the violet light. "Or they disappear." The midnight air outside the club tasted of damp concrete and ozone. The storm had finally broken, drenching Seoul in a cold, relentless downpour that turned the neon signs into bleeding smears of color. Jasmine pulled her jacket tight, her heart still hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was supposed to be heading for the bus stop, retreating back into the safety of her invisibility, but the weight of Rae-sung's gaze still felt like a physical brand on her skin. She took the shortcut through the narrow alley behind the hotel, a canyon of wet brick and overflowing trash bins. Halfway through, the world tilted. The sound was sharp, the metallic clang of a lead pipe hitting a dumpster, followed by the wet, heavy thud of a body hitting a wall. Jasmine froze, pressing herself into a recessed doorway. Through the curtain of rain, she saw him. Rae-sung was flanked by two of his men, but they were already down, dark pools of blood spreading into the rainwater. 6 figures emerged from the shadows of the fire escapes, their faces masked, their hands holding the matte black glint of silenced pistols and steel. They moved with the synchronized grace of professional assassins. Rae-sung stood alone in the center of the trap, his black suit slick with rain, his expression as unreadable as the obsidian eyes that had haunted her an hour ago. He reached for his waistband, but he was too slow. A second wave of attackers was closing the distance from behind. Behind you! The scream tore from Jasmine's throat before she could catch it. She didn't think about her visa, her family, or her survival code. She grabbed a heavy, rusted metal bar propped against a crate and swung it with everything she had, catching the lead assassin's arm just as he leveled his weapon at Rei Sung's head. The gun skittered across the wet pavement. The clang echoed through the narrow space like a funeral bell. The distraction was all Rei Sung needed. He moved like a shadow given lethal form, a blur of motion that ended in the sickening crack of bone. In seconds, the alley was a graveyard of groaning men. Jasmine stood shaking, the metal bar slipping from her numb fingers. The rain plastered her hair to her face, tears mixing with the cold droplets on her cheeks. She had broken the code. She was no longer a ghost. Rei Sung stepped over a fallen body, his breathing barely disturbed. He walked toward her until he was inches away, his towering frame boxing her in against the wet concrete. He braced one hand beside her head, his tattooed fingers curling against the brick. He didn't thank her. He didn't smile. He simply leaned down, his face a mask of controlled dominance, and looked into her terrified eyes. "You saved a life you weren't even supposed to see," he vibrated, his voice cutting through the roar of the rain. "Now, little shadow, you belong to the man who owns it." The transition from the grime of the alley to the sterile luxury of the penthouse was a silent, terrifying blur. Jasmine remembered the interior of a sleek black sedan, the scent of expensive leather and Rei Sung's sandalwood cologne, and then the pressurized ascent of an elevator that seemed to climb until the world below vanished. When the doors opened, she was met not by a room, but by a cathedral of glass. The penthouse was a vast, open expanse of polished obsidian floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the glowing nerves of Seoul. Outside, the city was a chaotic tapestry of neon. Inside, everything was cold, sharp, and silent. The lighting was desaturated, a cinematic teal blue that made the rain streaking across the glass look like liquid silver. Jasmine stood near the center of the room, her damp jacket heavy on her shoulders, her muddy boots an insult to the pristine space. She felt small, a fragment of the street caught in a high-rise spiderweb. "The guest suite is through the double doors." Rei Sung's voice came from behind her, low and resonant, echoing off the glass. She turned to find him shedding his ruined suit jacket. His black shirt was damp, clinging to the hard lines of his chest and shoulders. The sleeves were rolled up, revealing the bold, dark ink of the tattoos that spiraled down his forearms, designs that spoke of a history written in blood. He looked less like a businessman now and more like a king in a sanctuary he had built to keep the world out. "Guest." Jasmine's voice was a brittle whisper. "Mr. Rei Sung, I need to go home. My shift. I have to work tomorrow." Rei Sung stepped closer, the soft click of his shoes on the obsidian floor sounding like a countdown. He stopped just inches away, his presence overwhelming the air in her lungs. He reached out, his silver ring catching the blue light as he tucked a damp strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was clinical, yet it burned. "You have no home to go to, Jasmine," he said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it made her heart stutter. "The men in that alley saw your face. They know you are the reason their blade missed its mark. If you step outside these walls, you are a dead woman." He leaned down, his eyes locked on hers with a piercing intensity that offered no room for negotiation. "You aren't the help anymore. You are my best-kept secret. And in this house, secrets do not leave." He turned away, leaving her standing in the center of his glass empire. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a bird in a gilded cage, and the architect had just locked the door. The silence of the penthouse was a predator, stalking Jasmine as she stood by the glass wall. She had scrubbed the city's grime from her skin in a bathroom larger than her entire apartment, but she couldn't wash away the feeling of being watched. She wore a silk robe that had been left for her, charcoal gray and far too expensive, and it felt like a second skin, one that belonged to Rei Sung's world, not her own. A floorboard creaked, and the air shifted. The scent of sandalwood and ginger preceded him. Rae-sung was there, standing by a low bar, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass. He had changed into a clean black shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, looking less like a mafia boss and more like a man who owned the night itself. "I can't stay here," Jasmine said, her voice trembling but her chin held high. "I have a life. I have people who depend on me." Rae-sung didn't look up. He swirled the liquid in his glass, the ice clinking with a rhythmic, hypnotic sound. "The life you had ended the moment you touched my wrist in that club. It died the second you screamed in that alley. My enemies do not distinguish between a lover and a witness. To them, you are simply a vulnerability I haven't closed yet." He moved then, his pace slow and deliberate, until he stood directly in her path. He was a wall of heat and controlled dominance. Jasmine backed away until her shoulders hit the cool glass, the rain still drumming a frantic beat against the other side. "Is that what I am?" she whispered, her eyes searching his obsidian depths. "A vulnerability? A debt you have to manage?" Rae-sung reached out, his hand hovering near her throat before his thumb settled against the line of her jaw. His touch was no longer clinical, it was a slow, possessive fire. "I have spent my life building a world where nothing is out of my control. I architected this city so that every shadow serves a purpose. And then you walked into my light." He leaned in, his face inches from hers, his breath a warm ghost against her lips. "I don't keep you here because I owe you a debt, Jasmine. I keep you because I have spent 3 years watching you disappear into the corners of my club, and tonight, I finally realized I can't let you go back into the dark. You aren't a debt. You are an obsession I didn't see coming." The hardness in his gaze flickered, revealing a hunger that made her pulse leap in fear, and something far more dangerous. He wasn't protecting her out of mercy. He was claiming her because he had finally found the one thing in Seoul he couldn't manipulate, and he had no intention of letting anyone else touch it. The walls of the penthouse had begun to feel like a fortress made of ice, so when Rae-sung led her out into the midnight chill, the air felt like a shock to her system. They didn't go to a club or a gilded gala. Instead, the black sedan glided toward the edge of the Han River, stopping where the city's concrete fingers dipped into the dark, rushing water. The riverside was deserted, a rare pocket of silence in a city that never slept. The rain had softened into a fine mist that clung to the railing like diamonds. Rae-sung stepped out, leaning his weight against the cold metal, his back to the towering skyscrapers he had helped build. For the first time, he looked small against the vastness of the horizon. Jasmine joined him, her hands tucked into the sleeves of the heavy coat he had draped over her shoulders. The silence between them wasn't the suffocating tension of the club, it was something thinner, more fragile. "I used to come here when I had nothing," Rae-sung said, his voice barely a murmur above the lapping water. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the reflection of the neon lights dancing on the river's surface. "Before the suits, before the blood, I thought if I could just own one of those lights, I would finally be full." Jasmine looked at his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the subtle weariness in the corner of his eye that the Iron Boss never allowed the world to see. "And are you?" "Full." He turned then, the mist dampening his hair, making him look younger, stripped of his lethal armor. "No. I built a cathedral, but I forgot how to breathe inside it. Every brick is a debt. Every light is a target." He reached out, not with the possessive grip of a captor, but with a hesitant, almost human curiosity. His fingers brushed the back of her hand. "You look at me, and you don't see the architect. You see the man." "I see someone who is tired of holding up the sky," Jasmine whispered. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. The contrast of her dark skin against his pale, scarred knuckles was a map of 2 different worlds colliding in the dark. For a heartbeat, the mafia boss vanished. There was no underboss begging for life, no assassins in the alley, no code of shadows. There was only a man starving for something real and a woman who had spent so long hiding that she had forgotten what it felt like to be found. He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of the masks they had both dropped. The midnight air was cold, but as he pulled her slightly closer, the heat between them was the only thing that felt certain in a city built on illusions. The following morning, the shadow Jasmine had lived in for 3 years was systematically erased. It began with a knock on the double doors of the guest suite, followed by a procession of silent assistants carrying garment bags that hissed with the sound of expensive silk. There was no trace of her waitressing uniform. The polyester blend and the apron that smelled of industrial cleaner had been taken while she slept, likely burned or discarded like a shed skin. Raesung stood by the window, his back to the room as the tailors worked. He didn't look at her until the transformation was complete. When she finally stepped into his line of sight, the air in the room seemed to sharpen. Jasmine was no longer draped in oversized cotton or charcoal robes. She wore a gown of liquid gold that clung to her curves like a second skin, the metallic fabric a stunning contrast against the deep, rich mahogany of her shoulders. A heavy collar of diamonds sat against her collarbone, cold and authoritative. "The uniform you wore at the club was designed to make you disappear," Raesung said, turning slowly. He walked toward her, his eyes dark with a renewed intensity. He stopped so close she could smell the sandalwood on his skin. "This is designed to ensure no one ever looks past you again." He reached into a velvet box held by an assistant and pulled out a ring, a thick band of gold topped with a singular, flawless black diamond. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles before he slid the weight of the stone onto her finger. "I don't want you to hide, Jasmine. I don't want you to be the girl who cleans the spills," he murmured, his voice a low, possessive vibration. "From this moment, you are the woman who owns the room. If they look at you, they see my power. If they touch you, they answer to my steel." Jasmine looked at her reflection in the glass. The woman staring back looked like a queen, but the diamonds felt like a beautiful set of shackles. She was being rebranded, her immigrant struggle replaced by a lethal luxury. She was no longer a ghost in the machine of soul. She was the centerpiece of the Iron Boss's empire. "It's heavy," she whispered, lifting her hand to feel the weight of the gold. "It has to be," Raesung replied, his hand settling firmly on the small of her back, guiding her toward the door. "Safety is expensive, Jasmine. And today, the world begins to pay your price." The transformation was complete. The shadow was dead, and the queen had been forged in gold. The Grand Hyatt ballroom was a sprawling expanse of white marble and crystal chandeliers, but the atmosphere inside was thick with the scent of old blood and new money. This was the Syndicate Gala, the annual assembly of the city's most dangerous architects. Men who had spent decades trying to find a crack in Raesung's armor stood in clusters, their eyes sharp, their smiles forced. The room fell into a jagged silence when the heavy oak doors swung open. Raesung didn't enter as the Iron Boss today. He entered as a conqueror. He wore a charcoal suit that looked like it had been spun from shadows, but it was the woman on his arm who commanded the gravity of the room. Jasmine felt the weight of 1,000 stares, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the elite like a physical wave. In her gown of liquid gold, her mahogany skin glowing under the warmth of the chandeliers, she was a stunning anomaly. She wasn't just a guest, she was a declaration. Raesung's hand was a steady, warm pressure at the small of her back, guiding her through the sea of predators. He didn't rush. He wanted them to see. He wanted them to witness the shift in his world. As they reached the center of the floor, the head of a rival faction, an older man with eyes like flint, stepped forward to intercept them. "I didn't know the Iron Boss had an interest in foreign treasures," the man remarked, his gaze lingering on Jasmine with a calculated disrespect. The air around Raesung turned to ice. He didn't raise his voice, but the low vibration of it cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "She isn't a treasure, Park. She is the only thing in this room you aren't permitted to speak of." Raesung turned to Jasmine, his possessive fire flaring as he leaned in, his lips brushing her temple in a public display that was as much a kiss as it was a warning. "This is Jasmine," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "And she is mine. Any offense against her is an act of war against me." The claim was official. The brand was public. Jasmine kept her head high, the diamonds at her throat feeling colder than ever. She could see it in the way the men exchanged glances, the realization that the Iron Boss finally had a weakness. The Code of Shadows was truly buried now. By claiming her as his queen, Raesung hadn't just given her his protection, he had painted a target on her back that glowed brighter than the gold she wore. As they moved toward the VIP dais, Jasmine felt a shiver of dread. She was no longer invisible. She was the most valuable piece on the board, and the game had just turned lethal. The golden armor of the previous night felt like a dream as Jasmine navigated the quiet, high-end corridor of the hotel the following afternoon. Raesung had been called away to a secure briefing, leaving her under the watch of a hand-picked security detail. For a moment, the silence was a relief, a chance to breathe away from the suffocating intensity of his obsession. The betrayal came from the shadows she thought were her shield. Minho, a younger guard who had been a constant, silent presence since her arrival at the penthouse, stepped toward her with a polite bow. "Mr. Kong has requested you move to the secondary sublevel, Miss Jasmine. There has been a security breach in the lobby." Jasmine didn't question him. She hadn't yet learned that in Raesung's world, loyalty was a currency that could be devalued in a heartbeat. She followed him into the service elevator, the metal box descending into the bowels of the building where the luxury faded into raw concrete and dim, flickering fluorescent lights. The doors slid open, but it wasn't a secure car waiting for her. The sub-basement smelled of damp stone and exhaust. Standing in the center of the loading bay were 4 men she recognized from the gala, members of the Park faction. They didn't wear suits today. They wore tactical gear and the grim expressions of hunters. Jasmine turned to Minho, her heart slamming against her ribs. "What is this?" Minho wouldn't meet her eyes. He stepped away from her, his silence a jagged blade. "Park offered more than a boss who treats his men like stone, Jasmine. I'm sorry." Before she could scream, a heavy hand clamped over her mouth, the acrid scent of a chemical-soaked rag filling her lungs. She thrashed, her gold ring catching the dim light as she fought to stay conscious, her mind screaming for the man who had promised the world would pay for her safety. "She's smaller than she looked on the dais," one of the men remarked, his voice echoing through the hollow concrete void. "The Iron Boss has finally grown a heart. Let's see how much of his empire he's willing to burn to keep it beating." As the darkness pulled at the edges of her vision, Jasmine felt the cold floor beneath her. She was no longer a queen or a shadow. She was bait, a piece of leverage in a war of titans. The gilded cage had been breached, and as the van doors slammed shut, the city of Seoul disappeared into a terrifying, silent void. The warehouse was a skeletal ruin on the edge of the Han, smelling of rust, stagnant water, and the metallic tang of impending violence. Jasmine woke to the stinging slap of cold river water against her face. Her chair was bolted to the concrete, her wrists bound with zip ties that bit into her skin with every pulse of her heart. The man named Park stood before her, silhouetted against the moonlight filtering through the shattered windows. He looked at her not as a woman, but as a ledger, a column of numbers he intended to balance against Raesung's empire. "You are the architect's grand mistake," Park said, his voice a dry rasp. He leaned in, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes and bile. "He thinks he can buy a soul and call it a crown. But tell me, little expat, does the gold feel heavy now that it's brought you to a grave?" Jasmine's head throbbed, and the copper taste of blood filled her mouth. Fear tried to swallow her, to pull her back into the self-imposed smallness she had inhabited for years. She thought of the shadow she used to be, the girl who looked at the floor and stayed silent. But then she felt the weight of the black diamond on her finger, the brand of the man who had seen her when no one else would. She wasn't a shadow anymore. She was the fire he had ignited. "You're wrong about him," Jasmine whispered, her voice cracking but gaining strength. She looked up, meeting Park's gaze with a predatory focus that mirrored the man who owned her heart. "He didn't buy my soul. He gave me the power to stop hiding it." Park laughed, a hollow sound that echoed off the corrugated metal walls. "Defiance? You think a steady hand at a dinner table makes you a match for me?" "I think you're terrified," Jasmine replied, a cold, dangerous smile touching her lips. You didn't take me to break him. You took me because you're too weak to face him. You're using me as a shield because you know that when he walks through those doors, he won't be an architect. He'll be a god of war. And you're just the man standing in his way. Park's face contorted in rage, and he raised his hand to strike her. Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned into the threat, her mahogany skin glowing like embers in the dark. She was no longer the bait. She was the fuse. Kill me if you want, she spat, the blood in her mouth fueling her resolve. But know that every second you keep me here, you are architecting your own extinction. He's coming, and I hope you're ready to burn. The air in the warehouse didn't just grow cold. It died. One moment, Park was screaming into Jasmine's face, his hand raised in a snarl of frustrated power. The next, the heavy steel bay doors didn't just open, they vanished. A localized explosion of heat and pressure sent shrapnel whistling through the dark, followed by a silence, so absolute it felt like a physical weight. Then came the footsteps. Rae-sung didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked through the settling dust like a vengeful deity stepping onto a fresh battlefield. He had shed his tailored charcoal suit for a tactical black jacket, the sleeves pushed back to reveal the ink of his tattoos. Bold, dark designs that seemed to pulse with a life of their own in the flickering light. He held a matte black handgun with a casual, terrifying familiarity, his eyes reflecting nothing but a cold, predatory vacuum. The Iron Boss, one of Park's men, shrieked, raising his weapon. Rae-sung didn't even break his stride. He fired 3 times, the silenced cracks sounding like the snapping of dry wood. The men fell before they could find their triggers. He moved with a lethal, fluid geometry, a god of war reclaiming his territory. He moved through the gunfire as if he had architected the trajectory of every bullet himself, erasing anyone who dared to stand between him and the woman in the chair. Park scrambled backward, grabbing Jasmine by the hair and pressing a blade to her throat. Stay back. I'll end her. Rae-sung stopped. He was 10 feet away, his face a mask of such profound, icy lethality that Park's hand began to shake. The silver ring on Rae-sung's finger caught the light of a fire sparked by the breach. You touched what is mine, Rae-sung said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. You looked at her. You moved her into the dark. For that there is no negotiation. There is only erasure. In a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to track, Rae-sung didn't fire his gun. He threw a concealed blade that buried itself in Park's shoulder. As the man recoiled, Rae-sung was on him. He didn't use a weapon. He used his hands, a brutal, efficient display of power that left Park a broken heap on the concrete in seconds. Rae-sung turned toward Jasmine. The vacuum in his eyes shattered, replaced by a raw, possessive fire. He dropped to his knees, his tattooed fingers trembling as they sliced through her zip ties. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply gathered her into his arms, crushing her against his chest as if trying to merge her skin with his own. I have you, he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking. The world will burn for this, Jasmine. I promise you, it will burn. The smell of smoke and iron lingered on their skin as the elevator rose back to the glass cathedral above the clouds. Jasmine looked at her reflection in the polished metal doors. Her gown was torn, her skin was bruised, and the black diamond on her hand was caked with the dust of the warehouse. But for the first time, she didn't look like a victim. She didn't look like a ghost. Inside the penthouse, the city of Seoul lay at their feet, a shimmering carpet of light that no longer felt like a labyrinth designed to swallow her. Rae-sung stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the dawn. He was silent, the adrenaline of the slaughter fading into a heavy, watchful exhaustion. He had saved her, but the unspoken question hung in the air. Would she run back to the shadows, or would she stay in the fire? The car is waiting downstairs, Rae-sung said without turning. His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual command. I have secured a flight. New identity, a house in the States, enough money to ensure your family never has to work again. You can leave the blood behind, Jasmine. You can be invisible again. Jasmine walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the obsidian floor. She stood at his side, looking out at the skyline he had architected. She realized then that her self-imposed smallness was a relic of a woman who no longer existed. The immigrant who survived by being a shadow had died in that warehouse. "I spent my whole life trying to be a ghost, so I wouldn't get hurt," she whispered, reaching out to take his hand. Her dark fingers laced through his, feeling the steady thrum of his pulse. But ghosts don't have power. Ghosts don't change the world. They just haunt it. She turned to face him, forcing him to meet her gaze. The obsidian in his eyes flickered with a desperate hope he was too proud to voice. "I don't want the flight," Ray sung. "And I don't want to be the help or a secret anymore." She squeezed his hand, the black diamond catching the first light of the sun. "If I stay, I'm not staying as a guest in your cage. I'm staying as the woman who rules the architect's house." Ray Sung's breath hitched, his fingers tightening around hers with a possessive, reverent strength. The Iron Boss finally bowed his head, resting his forehead against hers in a silent surrender. "Then the foundation is set," he murmured. The struggle of the immigrant and the obsession of the boss had merged into something new, a sovereignty forged in blood and gold. Together, they looked out over their kingdom, no longer a predator and his prey, but two rulers standing on the edge of a new empire. The sun rose over Seoul, and for the first time, the shadows didn't hide Jasmine. They belonged to her. In a city that tried to reduce her to a shadow, Jasmine learned that survival is only the beginning, but self-worth is the real revolution. The moral of their story is this: never shrink yourself to make the world comfortable. The moment you stop hiding, you stop surviving, and start reigning. If you loved this story of power, passion, and transformation, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this video, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps these stories alive and the empire growing.